Welcome to episode 2. This was delayed a week because I forgot how extremely exhausting a show week is. I was gradually getting the number of naps that I had to take in a week down, and now we're back at one a day. Shows are really exhausting. I had my first 2-show day in about 5 years last week. Mad respect for people who do 8 shows a week every week. Today I have closing night, and essentially I have clearance to record this episode and do the show. And other than that, I need to rest. When this episode comes out, we will have finished all of our live performances, but you can still watch our stream until Tuesday. I'll link it in the show notes. Also, it's Songs for a New World. I'm doing Songs for a New World. Pitié, pitié, c'est ta vie que tu trans. Pitié, pitié, au boulet de ta champ. On brûle, on crève, c'est l'enfer là-dedans. Pitié, pitié, on en a épouvantant. The first interaction between the works of Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens wasn't when Alain Boublil saw Oliver in 1978. It actually happened years earlier, like a lot earlier, in 1846. Now this season, I have set myself the goal of citing my sources. I didn't want to break my personal pledge so early, but here we are. Wikipedia said that in 1846, Charles Dickens travelled to Paris and met Victor Hugo. I went to the citation and I found where they found the fact, and I googled it and I found this document quite easily. It's just that it would cost me somewhere between $400 and $800. I love this show and I'm willing to spend money on resources, but I just didn't feel like an $800 clarification, so I'm going to take them at their word on that one. Oliver Twist had been finished a few years earlier, in 1838. I say finished because it was released serially. Charles Dickens was the second child but the first son in a family that would rise and fall into and out of the gentility. His father worked for the naval service in an administrative type role. He had a reasonable salary, but like the family's fortunes, it would rise and fall according to whether or not he was in London or at an outpost. The additional outpost per diem type salary often kept the family in good standing. They moved often. John Dickens was not particularly judicious financially, so in times of lower income, the family took on debts. Charles was a bright child, but in his early years he was quite sickly. These factors, in addition to the large Dickens family library, meant that he read extensively. Novels, poetry, plays. He was particularly fond of the farces of Elizabeth Inchbald. In fact, theatre and the theatrical world would be a major influence throughout his life. Across his youth, Charles only spent about 3 years in formal schooling, at 9 or 10 years old, and then again in his young adulthood. In between these times came periods of familial destitution. A friend of the family offered Charles a job in his warehouse, working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The place was rat-infested, and his time there would remain, for the rest of his life, a personal shame. During this time, despite their poverty, the family found money to send Charles's sister to the Royal Academy of Music. The family debts continued to pile up, and they were eventually sent to debtor's prison. Charles continued to work, and his sister continued to study as a boarder at the Royal Academy of Music. Charles went very briefly into law as an adult before settling into an early career in journalism. His first novel was the serialized Pickwick Papers, which was released and written in monthly installments, followed by Oliver Twist. Much of these 2 novels were written concurrently. Each month he would write the next chapter for both. There was a time when he was writing 1,200 words for each novel every month, in addition to editing a magazine and looking after a newborn and taking care of his wife with postnatal depression, and I can only dream of that amount of productivity. A weekend of shows or a morning in hospital can just derail my whole week. At the time, his young sister-in-law Mary lived with Charles and his wife. She died tragically and suddenly at the age of 13 in Charles's arms. There will be many characters in his work that mirror her, the young girl, too good for this world and taken too soon. Dickens was also a serious fan of the theatre. Like, serious. He would attend at every possible opportunity. Before his writing took off, he had seriously considered a career as an actor. He had memorized certain monologues, which are multiple characters played by one actor. So a monologue with multiple poly characters. And he would perform them whenever he was given the chance. Given his love of theatre, it's not surprising then that his works are deeply theatrical. What's more surprising is how unremarkable the pieces he wrote for the stage were. In some sense, the theatrical adaptations of his works restored them to their rightful place. J'avais rêvé d'une autre vie, mais la vie a tué mes rêves. Comme on étouffe les derniers cris d'un animal que l'on chève. It was in Charles Dickens' final years, and the few years after that the golden age of operetta in England would begin. Late in his life, he would meet one of the men who would shape it, but couldn't have predicted the enormous success that would follow. In Nicholas Nickleby, Dickens had characters lament that the great age of theatre had passed. But if that was true, another was just beginning. In America, musical theatre grew out of musical comedy. But in Britain, it grew more so out of operetta or light opera. The golden age of operetta, like many eras of musical theatre to follow, was spurred on by the partnership between two men, Arthur Sullivan and William Schwenk Gilbert, more commonly listed in the other order as Gilbert and Sullivan. In 1867, Arthur Sullivan wrote the music for a charming one-act called Cox and Box. The concept, or notion, as Stephen Sondheim would call it, was that a landlord had rented the same apartment to two different men, one who worked days and the other who worked nights. It is hilarious and adorable and great. Arthur Sullivan had been born in 1842, the son of a professional clarinet player. It seemed like a career in music was inevitable for him. In his youth, he had learned a wide range of instruments and was a vocal soloist for the christening of one of Queen Victoria's children. No biggie. His first music would be published soon after, at age 13. The next year, and the 2 years following, he was a student on scholarship at the Royal Academy of Music. Following that, he began a career as a musician, composer, musical director, teacher, and the like. One of his early compositions was the popular hymn Onward Christian Soldiers. In 1862, at the age of 20, he met Charles Dickens. In 1870, he met William Schwenk Gilbert, and English operetta would change forever. William Schwenk Gilbert, or W.S. Gilbert, as I am henceforth going to call him, was the older of the pair, born in 1836. In his youth, he'd been kidnapped in Naples and briefly held for ransom, which his parents paid. As you'd imagine, it stuck with him, and children being kidnapped and the hijinks that would obviously ensue from it was a regular feature in his plots. He speedily won the reputation for being a clever, bright boy who was extremely lazy. It was soon discovered that he could work so quickly that his natural tendency to idleness was no handicap to his abilities. At least, that's what he said of himself. There's a saying that if you want to find the easiest way to do something, you find someone who's smart and lazy to do it. He wrote prolifically. By 24, he had written 15 pieces for the theatre, of which 15 were rejected. He worked for a time as a lawyer, another thing that would show up often in his later works. He also wrote and illustrated poems, cartoons, and other works before finding some success in theatre with Dulce Maria in 1866. In 1867, he attended a performance of Cox and Box, of which he wrote, "Mr. Sullivan's music is, in many places, of too high a class for the grotesquely absurd plot to which it is wedded." A match made in heaven. Gilbert's next success was in 1870 with The Palace of Truth. The same year, they would meet. The two of them met, and the lyricist asked the composer a complicated musical question, to which the latter didn't know the answer. They didn't really like each other, but they ran in the same circles. Their collaboration was destined. The next year, they wrote their first show together, Thespis. To get a full sense of their impact, I'm going to use Ganzl's Book of the Musical Theatre. They list 17 shows of consequence prior to 1890. 11 of them come from this pair. Trial by Jury, The Sorcerer, HMS Pinafore, Pirates of Penzance, Patience, Thank You for Having It With Me, Iolanthe, Princess Ida, The Mikado, Rodigo, Yeomen of the Guard, and The Gondoliers. That left only 5 not from the pair. The Baker's Opera, Billy Taylor, Rip Van Winkle, Erminie, and Dorothy. Rip Van Winkle became part of the French operetta repertoire, and Erminie became very successful on Broadway. What's the missing show on the list? Cox and Box, for which Arthur Sullivan wrote the music. A little note on the Beggar's Opera. It would later be adapted in the Brecht and Wheel show The Threepenny Opera, or in France the Fourpenny Opera, because the French wanted to charge more for tickets. The Gilbert and Sullivan partnership wouldn't last forever. The most sensationalized version of the story is that they had a falling out over carpets. A normal thing to break with your longtime writing partner over. More accurately, during the early production of The Gondoliers in 1889, Sullivan was on holiday and Gilbert got a letter informing him that the preliminary expenses amounted to the stupendous total of £4,500. Trust a lyricist to use the word stupendous in a regular letter. This sum included £500 for carpets for the front of house, i.e. a theatre expense, not really a production expense. This is what led to them breaking with their impresario, Richard D'Oyly Carte, and the Savoy Theatre where they had made their name. Without their regular theatre, the pair's other tension came to light. Sullivan didn't want to write operetta anymore. While French operetta would be known by its composers, the genius of the Gilbert and Sullivan pairing came as much or more from the brilliantly witty lyrics. The music was forced to be subservient. It's also important to note that while Gilbert had burnt the bridge with Carte, Sullivan hadn't. The Palace Theatre was being built by Carte as a home for English opera, exactly the kind of grand opera that Arthur Sullivan so wanted to write. An attempted peace meeting turned into W.S. Gilbert v. Richard D'Oyly Carte, and the partnership would be ended as we knew it. Interestingly, Gilbert and Sullivan shows rarely had successful runs on the continent, meaning in the rest of Europe. Gilbert's lyrics used complicated internal rhymes, which made them kind of impossible to translate. Think about trying to translate Hamilton. Translating shows always comes with challenges, but some shows are more translatable than others. Speaking of the continent, imported operettas were also an important part of the scene. Most of the French operettas I discussed last week ended up with runs in London, the US, and on the continent. If you're familiar with many of the popular operettas, you'll know that lots of them spawned from Vienna. Viennese opera sprouted largely from the work of Johann Strauss, who himself was inspired by Jacques Offenbach. It's all pretty linked together. Johann Strauss, or more accurately Johann Strauss Jr., was the son of a composer and orchestra conductor, but he was forbidden by his father from studying music. This isn't an episode on Viennese operetta. It's actually impossible for me to cover everything that ever happened. But the important thing about Johann Strauss was that he really kicked off the operetta tradition in Vienna. His work, Die Fledermaus, let's go with that, or The Bat, is one of the most enduring works. If you pick up any must-listen operatic collection, I've got the Reader's Digest Treasury of Classic Operetta or something, you'll find some Strauss work in there. The next era of operetta in Britain can be understood somewhat through the lens of the theatre. And by that, I don't mean the genre. I mean the physical location. I want to tell you about 3 notable ones: the Savoy, the Gaiety, and the Dailies. The Savoy was home to Gilbert and Sullivan operettas and, later, some similar fare. The Gaiety, as the name may well suggest, had the lighter fare on offer. Shows whose runs were likely shorter and didn't tour internationally. They were very successful at the time, but they were much less likely to be revived. The Dailies was a more serious operetta theatre. Hence, the shows had longer runs, international productions, and were much more likely to have been revived since. The genres of operetta and comic opera were not the only musical fare on offer in England. Like in the US, variety shows were hugely popular. British song and dance shows were different from their American counterparts, but the details are a bit beyond the scope of this episode. Operetta and comic opera were replaced more by song and dance variety shows. The Nautch Girl, produced at the Savoy in 1891, was programmed there to fill a gap caused by the breaking of the partnership between Gilbert and Sullivan. There would be a few successful shows over the years there. The Geisha in 1896 and A Greek Slave in 1898, along with a tense and ultimately unsuccessful reuniting of Gilbert and Sullivan with Utopia Limited in 1893 and The Grand Duke in 1896. If you're a Gilbert and Sullivan fan and you don't know those two, that's kind of my point. 1899 was the end of the century, but the beginning of a new era for operetta. There were 3 notable events that year. Firstly, Gilbert produced a London production of Offenbach and Halvary's Les Brigands. My French got bad again. Secondly, A Chinese Honeymoon. The show did something unusual. It was a popular musical comedy which began its life outside of London and the major theatres. It was originally set to perform an 8-week tour, but after its transfer to the West End, it became the first musical to play over 1,000 metropolitan performances. In tracing the lineage of a mega musical like Les Miserables, it's a pretty important moment. The third thing was the birth of the man who would define the next era of English musical theatre, Noel Coward. He gave English musical comedy its style. Think of him as an English Cole Porter. It's certainly the way the comparative biography Noel and Cole, the Sophisticates, viewed them. Noel Coward was born near Christmas in 1899, hence his name. He showed an early interest in music and was encouraged by his parents. It's not surprising, given that they'd met singing in the St Albans Choir and performed together in amateur dramatics, often Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. Noel's father would build sets for the boys' toy theatre, and his mother coached him in singing. She also regularly took him to the theatre to see the newest operetta, and the pair would come home with the sixpence lyric book. That small purchase, along with Noel's incredible musical memory, allowed him to reproduce the show at home for his family. He started to train in dance from a young age. His mother saw that his dance skills were not up to the level of his music, so she enrolled him in dance lessons. His studies included point work, which, as someone who began point work quite recently, His training progressed, and his mother saw an article about a lady who was casting a show. She'd found all the girls she needed, but was still looking for boys. English ballet legend Ninette de Valois also came through this program. His mother took him, and he was accepted, being paid the reasonable sum of £1.50 guineas a week. Well, they paid him 1 week. He continued to work as a child actor, but where he spent the war would define his writing style. The mission to get children out of London led to the residents of Hambleton Hall offering him a place to stay. It was exactly the type of house where one would hear salon dialogue, the style which would define his career. He also met Gladys Calthrop, a set and costume designer who he would later work with. His next few years professionally were unremarkable. He wrote lyrics for a music publisher, which by and large never saw the light of day. He made his adult debut in Saving Grace. He'd continued to perform small acting roles as he tried to write a play which could be produced. He wrote Ida Collaborates with his very, very extremely close friend, Esme Wynne, before being conscripted in 1918. It turns out he was not a great soldier, injured himself, and was sent home within the year. His success with Esme led him to want to write something on his own. His first attempt was The Last Trick, a play which was sold but never staged. His friend and the son of a great playwright, Gilbert Miller, passed on his father's advice. The construction of a play is as important as the foundation of a house, whereas the dialogue, however good, can only be considered as interior decoration. He tried again, focusing more on plotting with The Rat Trap. He wrote a series of unproduced plays, while acting in others' works. His play I'll Leave It to You had a successful run in Manchester, but was considered too thin for the West End. Noel Coward wanted to bring the show to London anyway. He found some funding, and as it turns out, it was too thin for London. His next work was a successful stage adaptation of his own unfinished novel, Cats and Dogs. Having found some success, he travelled to London to find work there, by which point he'd found himself in an industry that was changing. Mon histoire, c'est un rêve qui commence dans les pages d'un conte de mon enfance. Les yeux fermés, mon prince enfant m'enlace, et je prie pour que jamais son trône ne se défasse. One interesting new show was The Merry Widow by Franz Lehar. It was fully orchestrated, and in the theatre they sold merch. Obviously, 1905 didn't have hoodies with the show's logo, but Merry Widow hats were sold at the theatre and actually became a staple of fashion for years to come. French operetta composer André Messager also brought a number of his works to London. He trained at the École Niedermeyer, a school which was set up to train church musicians but ended up as a launch pad for operetta. One professor there was Saint-Cyenne, who gave us our operetta quote last week. There aren't many Messager operettas that are still in the common repertoire. The only one of his works I'd actually heard of before beginning my research was a ballet, The Two Pigeons. If you want a charming, adorable pas de deux, I'll link it in the show notes. It's truly delightful. Alongside writing operetta, Messager was a talented conductor, like really talented. This led to him receiving a number of appointments as artistic director or conductor of various organizations. These included the Folies Bergère, Opera Comique, and Paris Opera. The Folies Bergère at the time was not the raunchy institution it would become. He also spent a good deal of time in England, partly because of his British second wife. He was then the director of Covent Garden. A good number of his later operettas were written to appeal more to an English audience than a Parisian one, although he had successful runs in both countries. He also wrote a work which formed a key part of the lineage of Alain Boublil and Claude-Michel Schomburgk's second English language work, Miss Saigon. Operettas like Lecoq's Fleur de Terre, changed from Le Mikado, and Messager's Madame Chrysanthemum laid the groundwork for Puccini's Madama Butterfly. This work would serve as the source material for Miss Saigon. An interesting coincidence is that Puccini also attempted to adapt Les Miserables into an opera, but found the plot too complicated. In 1929, Noel Coward wrote Bittersweet, which many believe parochialized the British musical for the next 50 years. That gets us up to 1979. I wonder what happened around then. I'm going to pretend not to know. Bittersweet was choreographed by Tilly Loesch, who you might remember from the last season as having had Les Ballets created for her by her husband. She was the original principal dancer in Balanchine, Brecht, and Weil's ballet The Seven Deadly Sins. It was Coward's first operetta, precursor to the integrated musical. It ran in London for 769 performances. In the era before the long-running musical, that's pretty impressive. Something like A Chinese Honeymoon was really the outlier. It had a Paris run under the title Au Temple des Vals, tying everything together. There were two film adaptations, a 1933 British one and a 1941 Hollywood one. Neither valued particularly fidelity to the original script. Alan J. Lerner would write of Noel Coward that his comedy lyrics were the funniest of anyone to come down the lyrical pike, be they witty, silly in the best sense, outrageous, or glibly cynical. The best known of the Coward canon would come in the next few years. Private Lives was a play about a divorced couple who still loved each other and their new partners. Noel Coward acted in this one alongside Gertrude Lawrence and Laurence Olivier. That's Laurence Olivier of the Olivier Awards fame. Also probably the most famous Shakespeare actor of all time. We'll touch on him again briefly when we talk about the Royal Shakespeare Company. That's in maybe 3 or 4 episodes? It's coming. In 1936, Private Lives got a French film version because, of course, the French would love a play about remarried divorcees trying to get back together. The French, am I right? Noel's 1934 musical conversation piece and 1939's Present Laughter were also huge successes. These shows brought us to a new decade, where the integrated musical would grow up, but it wasn't the only thing born in the 1940s. Les Miserables creators Alain Boublil and Claude Michel Schomburg would both be born. They would grow up on opposite sides of the world from each other and secluded somewhat from this growing tradition, seeing only small spurts of it that would inspire them. Next week, we're going to explore these three childhoods. Until then. À la volonté du peuple et à la santé du progrès, remplis ton cœur d'un vent rebelle et à demain, ami fidèle. Nous voulons faire la lumière, malgré les masques de la nuit, pour une lumière, notre terre changer la vie.